Deep in the heart of the Rockies, there exists a lodge shrouded in mystery. Known as Frostwood Retreat, it once thrived as a winter getaway, but was abandoned nearly 3 decades ago after a series of unexplained events. Locals spoke of hikers who went missing, strange lights sung from the windows, and most chillingly, faint screams carried by the wind at night. Ethan, an adventurous travel blogger, heard of Frostwood Retreat from an old Reddit forum. Intrigued by the chilling stories, he decided to document his visit. Equipped with a camera, drone, and flashlight, he set out. Despite the warnings of locals who urged him to stay away, Ethan reached the lodge at dusk, its silhouette casting a haunting shadow against the snowy peaks. The air was eerily still, and the crunch of snow beneath his boots seemed deafening. As he entered, the wooden doors groaned loudly, almost as if protesting his arrival. The inside was a frozen time capsule. Dust-covered furniture, an old piano with yellowed keys, and family photos left behind told of lives abruptly interrupted. But the deeper Ethan ventured, the stranger things became. Walls bore scratch marks, and an unsettling smell of dampness and decay lingered. He set up his camera in the grand dining hall, intending to capture footage for his vlog. As the night fell, the temperature inside the lodge dropped drastically. Ethan heard faint footsteps above him. Assuming it was wildlife, he climbed the staircase to investigate, but found only empty rooms and silence. Around midnight, the true horror began. His camera captured fleeting shadows darting across the walls, though nothing visible to the naked eye. Doors slammed shut on their own, and a chilling voice whispered his name from the darkness. Ethan tried to leave, but the lodge seemed to conspire against him. The front door, which had been wide open, was now locked tight. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for him. In the dead of night, he stumbled upon a hidden room behind the library. Inside, he found a journal belonging to the last caretaker, Thomas Crane. The entries detailed strange occurrences, the disappearance of guests, voices calling from the woods, and finally, Thomas's descent into madness. The last page read, "They don't let you leave. The lodge takes what it wants." Panic set in as Ethan realized he was not alone. He heard heavy breathing and the shuffling of feet. The walls began to pulse, as if the lodge itself was alive. A guttural scream erupted from the shadows, and Ethan ran for his life, abandoning his gear. The next morning, search parties found no trace of Ethan, except his camera. The footage showed him frantically running, his screams echoing through the lodge before the screen went black. Frostwood Retreat remains abandoned, and Ethan's story is now part of its chilling legend. Months after Ethan's disappearance, his sister, Claire, was determined to uncover the truth. She was no stranger to his adventurous spirit, but something about his vanishing felt different. Authorities ruled it an accident, citing harsh weather and animal attacks, but Claire wasn't convinced. After reviewing his recovered footage, she noticed something chilling, a fleeting shadow with an unnatural shape moving in the background. Claire decided to retrace Ethan's steps. With a map of the Rockies, her brother's notes, and a deep-seated determination, she set off for Frostwood Retreat. Unlike Ethan, she prepared extensively: thermal cameras, motion detectors, and even a satellite phone for emergencies. Yet, as she reached the lodge, an oppressive silence greeted her, making her question if she had made the right choice. Inside, the lodge seemed even more foreboding than in Ethan's footage. The air was heavy, and the faint smell of burnt wood lingered. As she explored, she noticed things Ethan hadn't mentioned. cryptic carvings on the walls, faint trails of blood leading into dark corners, and strange patterns in the dust, as if something had been crawling. Her first night was quiet, though far from peaceful. Claire slept lightly, waking often to the sound of faint whispers. They weren't random, they were rhythmic, almost like a chant. Her motion detectors went off sporadically, but each time she checked, nothing was there. The second night, things escalated. She found her equipment mysteriously rearranged, her thermal camera showing heat signatures in empty rooms. The whispers grew louder, now distinctly calling her name. Claire followed the sound, leading her to the library where Ethan had found the caretaker's journal. Behind the hidden door, Claire discovered more than Ethan had. A deeper passage, leading to what appeared to be a cellar. The air grew colder as she descended, and the walls were lined with claw marks and dark stains. At the bottom, she found a circular room filled with strange relics, burnt photographs, shards of mirrors, and an altar with a weathered book lying open. The book contained a ritual, one that bound the spirits of those who died in the lodge to the building itself. The lodge wasn't just a place, it was a living entity, feeding on the fear and lives of its victims. Ethan's name was scrawled on one of the pages, along with dozens of others. Before Claire could process what she was seeing, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find a figure, a shadowy, distorted version of Ethan. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken, and his voice echoed unnaturally as he said, "You shouldn't have come." The lodge began to shake, the walls closing in as if it were alive. Claire fled up the stairs, but the way out seemed endless, as if the lodge had changed its structure to trap her. Desperation set in as the shadows grew, their whispers turning into deafening screams. Just as she was about to give up, Claire remembered the satellite phone. She dialed the emergency line, screaming for help. The operator heard only static, but search parties were dispatched to the area. The next morning, Claire was found unconscious near the lodge's entrance, clutching Ethan's journal. When she awoke in the hospital, she could only whisper, "The lodge let me go, but it won't stop." The authorities sealed Frostwood Retreat, but locals claim the lodge is still active. On cold nights, whispers can be heard in the wind, and faint lights flicker in the windows. Claire, now traumatized, warns everyone she meets. The lodge isn't haunted, it's alive, and it's waiting. Claire couldn't shake the nightmares. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's hollow face and heard the lodge's whispers calling her back. The journal she brought back seemed to have a presence of its own. At night, she swore she could hear pages rustling as if it were alive. Against her better judgment, Claire decided to research the lodge's dark history, convinced it was the only way to stop its curse. Her investigation led her to a historian named Dr. Alan Reeves, an expert in occult architecture. When she showed him the journal, he turned pale. "This isn't just a building," he explained. "It's a conduit. Structures like Frostwood Retreat were designed to trap and harness spiritual energy. The rituals in this book, they're ancient, meant to bind souls to the place forever. It's feeding off them." Dr. Reeves revealed that the lodge's original owner, Elias Frostwood, was a practitioner of forbidden rituals. He had lured people to the lodge under the guise of hospitality, only to sacrifice them in a dark ceremony that fused his soul with the building. "Elias is the lodge," Reeves said, "and he's still hunting." Claire's blood ran cold. The journal's final page described a counter-ritual, one that could sever the lodge's connection to the spirit world, but it required confronting the entity at the heart of the lodge. Desperate to free herself from its grip, Claire decided to return, this time with Dr. Reeves and a team of paranormal investigators. The group arrived at Frostwood Retreat, armed with everything they could carry: protective charms, cameras, salt lines, and fire accelerants. As they entered, the lodge seemed to react, the air growing dense and suffocating. Shadows danced on the walls, and faint screams echoed through the hallways. They set up a base in the grand hall, marking a protective circle with salt. Dr. Reeves began the counter-ritual, chanting from the journal. As the words filled the air, the lodge grew restless. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath them trembled. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into humanoid forms, their faces twisted with anguish. They lunged at the group, but the salt barrier held them back. Claire recognized one of the forms. It was Ethan. Tears streamed down her face as he reached out, mouthing the words, "Help me." The ritual required Claire to confront Elias Frostwood's essence directly. The journal directed her to the basement, the very room where Ethan had vanished. Against the advice of the team, Claire descended alone. The basement was alive with malevolence. The walls pulsed, and the symbols etched into them glowed faintly. At the center of the room stood a dark, towering figure with burning eyes. It was Elias Frostwood, his form half human, half shadow. "You dare defy me?" His voice boomed, shaking the room. Claire held the journal tightly, reciting the final lines of the counter-ritual. The figure screamed, and the lodge began to collapse around her. Ethan's shadowy form appeared beside her, his eyes pleading. Claire hesitated, then reached out to him. The moment their hands touched, a blinding light filled the room. The shadows screamed and dissolved, and the oppressive weight of the lodge lifted. When Claire opened her eyes, she was outside, lying in the snow. The lodge was gone. Nothing remained but ashes. Claire returned home, feeling a sense of closure, though the scars remained. Ethan's camera, recovered from the ruins, contained one last message. Ethan's shadowy face speaking directly to her. "Thank you, Claire. You freed us. But be careful. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed." Frostwood Retreat may have been destroyed, but whispers of its dark presence linger. Travelers report seeing lights in the area where it once stood, and some claim to hear faint screams carried by the wind. Claire now spends her days warning others about the dangers of places like Frostwood, but deep down, she knows the lodge's story isn't truly over. Somewhere, in the cold, dark wilderness, Elias Frostwood waits, watching and perhaps rebuilding. Months after the lodge's destruction, Claire believed the nightmare was over. But strange events began to unfold. It started with subtle things. Doors in her home creaking open on their own, shadows flickering where there was no light, and that same faint, oppressive chill she had felt at the lodge. One evening, as she reviewed Ethan's recovered footage again, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the final frame, just before the camera went black, there was a fleeting image of Elias Frostwood's eyes, burning, angry, and staring directly at her. She froze as she realized destroying the lodge didn't end Elias. It freed him. Claire's nightmares became more vivid. In them, she was back at Frostwood, wandering its endless hallways as Elias's voice echoed around her. Each dream ended the same way, with her standing before the burning lodge, only to see its ashes form into a new, more sinister structure. Seeking answers, she reached out to Dr. Reeves, who had survived their previous ordeal but was now a recluse. When Claire arrived at his remote cabin, she found him pale and shaking. "It didn't work," he said, his voice trembling. "Elias wasn't destroyed. He's stronger now, free from the lodge but tethered to you. He's using you as a conduit to rebuild." Dr. Reeves explained that by performing the counter ritual, they had broken Elias's connection to the lodge, but inadvertently transferred his essence to Claire. She was now the anchor he needed to reclaim his power. The only way to stop him, Reeves explained, was to sever the link by returning to where the lodge once stood and confronting him directly. But this time, the battle wouldn't be fought with chants and symbols. It would be a test of Claire's will against Elias's raw power. Claire returned to the site of Frostwood Retreat, armed with the last remnants of the journal, a protective talisman Reeves had given her, and her own unshakable determination. The ashes of the lodge had long since been buried under snow, but as Claire stood there, she felt the ground tremble. The air grew thick, and a towering structure began to rise from the earth. Dark, twisted, and far more malevolent than the original lodge. Its windows glowed with an eerie red light, and the faint sound of screams echoed from within. As Claire stepped inside, the lodge seemed alive, pulsating with a dark energy. Elias's voice surrounded her, mocking her. "You've returned, little one. Did you think you could escape me?" The lodge warped around her, its hallways stretching endlessly, its walls closing in. Shadows clawed at her, whispering her fears and doubts. But Claire held her ground, clutching the talisman and reciting the words Reeves had taught her. A spell of banishment designed to sever Elias's connection to her once and for all. Elias appeared before her, more powerful than ever, his form a writhing mass of darkness with glowing red eyes. He laughed as she chanted, the lodge shaking violently. "You think you can defeat me? I am eternal." But Claire didn't stop. She focused on the memory of Ethan, on the lives lost to Frostwood, and on her own will to survive. The talisman began to glow, emitting a blinding light that pierced through Elias's shadowy form. Elias screamed, his voice shaking the very foundation of the lodge. The walls began to collapse, and the shadows disintegrated. Claire felt a sudden release, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had been lifted. As the lodge crumbled around her, she ran outside, watching as the structure imploded, leaving nothing but silence. For the first time in months, the air felt still and peaceful. Claire returned home, finally free of Elias's grip. She donated the journal to a secure archive, ensuring no one else could misuse its power. But she knew her experience would stay with her forever. Though the nightmare seemed to be over, Claire couldn't ignore the faint whispers she still occasionally heard in the wind, reminders that some forces never truly die. Far away, deep in the wilderness, another shadowy structure began to rise, its presence unnoticed by the world. Elias Frostwood wasn't finished. Not yet.